So, welcome to the session on community-based risk assessment, which is somewhere here. Anyway, just to make it look good. We are going to have 4 speakers today, and we've decided, as practitioners who like to discuss things with communities, we want to avoid just sort of the question-answer approach, but rather really have discussion. So we will, during the presentations, be collecting questions on cards, written questions, that the person in the orange shirt will be collecting. But make sure you get them in early, because we will address a few questions right after the presentations, but then we want to open it up for discussion. And we have a microphone set up in the middle of the room so that we can all hear what you're saying and all of your great thoughts can be shared with everyone. When we were meeting, sort of to get ready for this session, we realized we all felt a bit like strangers in a strange land. Here we are, sort of 4 people who are used to working really at the grassroots level with communities in the field, getting dirty and sweaty. And here in this beautiful building, hearing about all sorts of super high-tech things and really fancy stuff, and man, it's fantastic, but we felt a little out of place. So I can promise there's not going to be any fancy reports or fancy charts in this session. It's not going to be much academically challenging stuff to ponder about. It's going to be very simple and understandable. And in fact, in the Red Cross anyway, that's one of our main goals in how we work, is to keep it as simple as possible. But we believe with our simple approaches we have huge impacts, and we really are helping the most vulnerable people. To give an example of what this means in terms of programming, last year I did a survey across the whole Red Cross network, so 186 national societies. And on average, to do disaster risk reduction, we spend $5 per person per year. That's pretty cheap, and yet we're still pretty effective. So keeping it simple has a certain advantage in terms of cost effectiveness and getting impact. So we've changed the order of presenters a bit compared to what's in the program. We're going to start with Nicole Williams, who's the Disaster Management Officer at the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies in the Caribbean. We'll then hear from Edmund Azarayan, anyway, I can't pronounce it, who is the Head of Disaster Management and Population Movement at the Armenian Red Cross Society. We'll then move on to hear from Manu Gupta, who is the co-founder and director of SEEDS in India, which is the Sustainable Environment and Ecological Development Society. And finally, we'll hear from Maya Asaf, who is the Humanitarian Emergency Affairs Manager at World Vision International in Lebanon. So, without any further ado, I'll pass the word over to Nicole.
Hi, I'm Nicole. I'm the Disaster Management Officer for the Red Cross Sub-Regional Office in the Caribbean. Our zone office is in Panama, and the English-speaking Caribbean support comes out of Port of Spain in Trinidad. That's it. There we go. The presentation's basically about some of the challenges we've had. For starters, when we began community disaster management in the Caribbean, about 15 to 20 years ago, we, having all graduated, decided that it would be an upstream, downstream, and we'd start with research papers, etc., etc. But we immediately ran into a wall in that to do research in the Caribbean, particularly for floods, you don't have data or not very long data streams to be able to do projections from. So it's kind of spurious, some of the projections you do. So that presented a long timeline to delivering any sort of product. It's also been found that there is a lot of research done, but it's all sitting on shelves somewhere, in a ministry, in an engineering office, in a university somewhere, bits and pieces of data that everyone thinks is proprietary, and so we can't get our hands on it. So even if you wanted to do the research, you would have to start from scratch in many instances. Even if we produce the final product, the technical information doesn't translate very well. How do I explain to somebody the attenuation of a tsunami wave? And I think we had a whole session earlier today about the 1 in 100-year flood. These are difficult concepts. I agree with the lady in the room who earlier said, we don't talk about climate change in communities. We talk about change. What changes are you seeing? Yeah? And we get results that way. First, even if you quantify the risk, we're laughed at in the community. We take storm surge modeling into the community and they look at us and go, so what, we knew about that? That was well known to us. Or floods, we do the flood mapping and they go, well yeah, that's known to us, so why did you spend all that money instead of coming to fix the problem? You know? So we've taken abuse for that as well. And even if we took these things in that they didn't know about, unless we're going in with a sort of solution to help mitigate or reduce the risk, what is the point? It's a lovely report. It's excellent, in fact. It looks great on paper, lots of bells and whistles. But how does it actually reduce risk in the places that are at risk? So we've tried to combine some of these good studies with early warning systems. And we found that we have flaws there as well. One of it is, for example, in Puerto Rico some years ago, they had an excellent early warning system which alerted the center, and the center alerted the communities, and everyone went up country for Four Kings Day, and the telephones couldn't reach them. And no one could issue the warning, and people died. We have, for example, NOAA talks, National Hurricane Center talks to our meteorologists, and they decide on when the warning should go out, and they come out on our radios, and our Met Services issues them to radio stations. And all the radio stations today are digital. So there's very few people to actually receive the fax warning or the email warning that comes from the Meteorological Service to broadcast it. And even if they could, many of them don't do updates on a regular basis. So the warnings don't go out in time. So we have issues with stuff like that. That's great stuff, but it just doesn't reach where it needs to go. And then we do have technical studies. For example, the Seismic Research Unit of the University of the West Indies has produced some really good volcanic hazard mapping for the region, which helps us to do planning in the future. The water resources agencies in Jamaica and Trinidad have produced flood hazard mapping, but they use it to establish the datums for the flood gauge boards that they put up in the community against a mango tree. And that way the community can then take charge of the warning themselves. And they can decide when it is time to leave and evacuate. What we do in the community, therefore, is what we might nickname, since this is a World Bank forum, I thought I'd introduce an investing term, value investing. Because communities have great intrinsic value. They don't produce a lot of gain in the early stages that you can shout about. But in the long term, the dividends are great. You know, the long-term gains in the community are excellent. So for the Red Cross in the Caribbean, we have a disaster management strategy that runs till 2014. This year alone, that very simple strategy is going to hit 50 communities and reach about 75,000 people. And we're not doing it by scaling up our operations to become big institutions. We're going to do it in partnership with people who are already working in the field. So all our Red Cross societies, from the Finnish to Japanese, Norwegians, and also the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency, and it's the National Disaster Offices that work with them, we're working with them. So we want to make sure that the little money that we have goes a much longer way. This works for us because at the end of the day, we've found that 2 years on, the communities that we've trained are actually still getting involved in risk reduction, and they're still getting involved in helping their neighbors, just recently in Dominica and also in Antigua. So we call it small initiatives because there's nothing fancy about it. In fact, it's downright you have to get out into the field and not in the nicest parts of Antigua or Barbados where all the tourists see. We go in the back where all the staff who work in the hotels live. And we help them by letting them do the work. So they're the ones that do the risk assessment. As Daniel says, it's not going to be academically rigorous. This vulnerability and capacity assessment is for them. Help communities understand their risk. Sometimes they already know it, sometimes they rediscover it. What we do out of that is we ask them, knowing the risk, to come up with their own solutions to that risk. So we do micro-projects and we fund those micro-projects. The micro-projects then are very small, 3,000 to 5,000 US, but the micro-projects actually deliver a risk reduction within the community. To make sure that they have a first response capacity, we also train them in first response, search and rescue, first aid, opening shelters, etc., so that they can help themselves long before the authorities get there. The big impact for this is that because the community does it themselves, that we don't go in there and do it for them, they actually take ownership of it. It's theirs. Even the report's theirs. We give it to them. And therefore, they buy into whatever the strategy is for reducing risk in the community. The nice part about this is they don't only produce risk reduction strategies for small projects, they actually identify some really big projects that need to be done as well. But they just don't have the capacity on their own to do it. And these are costly, long-term projects. So what we find is that if we can get communities to stop waiting on government to do the fix and someone else, they actually get up. And once they see success in one way, we found that we have communities who are then poised when elections and other things come around to say, oh, what do we need? Well, it's funny you should mention it, because we have this report here, and we need this. Yeah? So they're in a better position to advocate for what they need. The good part about this for us, too, is that we don't just have disaster management programs, we also have health programs, and we have climate change adaptation programs. And we found that we've discovered saltwater intrusions, we've discovered coastal erosion. The community doesn't know this is climate change. They don't care. They don't care what you call it because it's affecting them. And so we're able to then start looking at those issues as well out of the research. We're able also to use these same community members to help educate their neighbors in health issues. So for example, when H1N1 came around, it was these community teams that went door to door to help their neighbors learn about what to do to reduce the risk. As I said before, it's a small initiative. It doesn't pay off right away, but it does have great gains, and it has to be done in partnership. We don't think in the Red Cross we can do it alone, so we have to do it with other people. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Edmond Azaryan. I'm from Armenian Red Cross, and I would like to share with you some experiences of community level hazard and vulnerability assessment, which we used to do for supporting communities, as I titled my presentation, to become more safer and resilient to disasters. The method we used is called Vulnerability and Capacity Assessment, which was developed by International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies and is used by national societies since 1995. The idea was to simplify this risk assessment, like risk, vulnerability, hazard definitions, and to make it acceptable for locals, for people living in the communities, and to make them realize what is going around them. I will present the methodology, how we implement this assessment, and what are the main outcomes from this assessment. The idea of this assessment, this is not just to implement the assessment and develop some report for the communities, but this is to stay with them after even implementing this assessment and to support them in their capacity building, in their preparedness, and in their awareness raising and mitigation initiatives. And that's why I call the disaster preparedness and mitigation based on the VCA results, what we do after these assessments. There are 5 approaches within the methodology. This is the master way with inhabitants. This is the individual and structured interviews with key persons within the community. This is a focus group discussions, or in some cases workshops. This is hazard mapping, stakeholder mapping in terms of their projects and activities in a region. Why in a region? Because we consider communities somehow left alone, and the only area and only stakeholders which they can expect some support or integration into their local activities, this is stakeholders at regional level, and like they never expect something from national ones. In terms of mass survey with inhabitants, we have developed special questionnaire for inhabitants and for key persons, which we use to gather to collect information from community inhabitants on the context where they live, on their vulnerability, on the hazard level, and on the local capacities. As you see from the presentation, we always try to keep the balance between the gender. And usually this is like 50-50. It's not common too much for Armenia and for like maybe for most developing countries to involve women in such an activities like civil society activities, but we are trying to encourage communities to involve more women into civil activities and to pay more attention in the integration of women in their community life. And during this mass survey, we fill the special questionnaires and we organize we open some discussion with the people. This is not just a checklist where we are asking questions and putting yes or no. We are discussing with them. We are explaining all the questions, and this also helps us to reach more people and to attract their attention on the issue as much as possible. In terms of individuals, as a key persons, we identified as a key persons at community level the heads of communities, the deputies, heads of communities, special technicians working in the community, the head of medical center, headmasters, and school administration. These are the people whom we work and consider as a key persons, considering that their knowledge and perception on risks and capacities and local context is more higher than ones of the inhabitants, and their way of thinking is also a bit different from individuals. Focus group discussions or workshops. We do it. We gathered some 20-25 people in one area and opening the discussion with them on the vulnerability level of the community and the hazards threatening them. And this is always we are trying to collect people from different groups, from considering the age, gender, and their social and economical conditions. Hazard mapping. This is not the scientific or technical mapping as we saw during last presentations, but this is a simple mapping which helps us through our direct observations and examination to capture the community, the whole community, its location, the risk areas of the community, the main infrastructures, the neighboring communities, and it looks like this. This is this is a map developed for one of our communities in Tavush region, and ideally, when we do it, it was assigned just for our use and for our donors and stakeholders. But when the community leaders really asked us for providing them with this map, saying that they haven't such a practical map which shows clearly all the risky areas and the hazard-prone areas and the infrastructures which are under these areas, we decided to develop digital version of these maps and to provide them as an annex to the report which we developed based on the results. Stakeholder mapping, as I mentioned already, this is the hope at local level to receive some support, technical and financial. That's why we are trying to map who are the main stakeholders at local level who are dealing with disaster risk reduction and other areas dealing with disaster risk reduction. The main outcomes of the assessments, I mentioned three different points because we did different projects, one for UNDP, one for GTZ, and for IFRC, and now it's running with DIPECO. The difference is that, according to the objective of the project, the final product was different. Like for UNDP, the final product was to define the most risky communities, 40 communities from 94 assessed, and then to develop detailed disaster mitigation and preparedness activities per each of these communities. Like for GTZ case, it was the provision of general recommendations for national, regional level governments, for stakeholders, and like in the case with Federation and with DPECO, we are developing detailed plan of action for disaster preparedness and mitigation. And we don't do this alone to ensure the ownership of regional authorities, of local authorities, and like LEMA, we involve them in the process of development of this plan of action. And the idea is to guide them, to give them proposals, what are the main activities should be implemented in terms of risk assessment and analysis, preparedness and mitigation, showing the timetable, persons in charge and partners whom they can work to reach the results. And at the end, I would like to show how we link this VCA, this assessment, with disaster preparedness and mitigation. And usually we build our projects not just for assessment, but assessment is the first step of our project, and we follow based on the assessment results. And we, according to our present experience, we form community preparedness and response teams. We establish some such teams. We support communities to select the team members. We support communities to organize special first aid trainings, basic rescue assessment trainings, and then we encourage these teams to become an advocacy tool within the community and to advocate for their needs and for their protection. The other component, this is contingency planning, where we are supporting communities, and as a Red Cross, we have developed jointly with GTZ special guideline on disaster management planning and provided to our beneficiary communities to revise the existing budgets and to make them in line with international standards as well. The legislative advocacy, the trainings and drills, and fostering of mitigation activities. As a Red Cross, we haven't any practice of providing special funds for mitigation activities for communities, but anyhow we are supporting them in developing like micro projects, and we are supporting them in fundraising for these micro projects. In terms of legislative advocacy, I would like to highlight that we are fostering communities to include in their community annual budget special line for disaster risk reduction. According to the legislation of Armenia, there are only two sources for state funding. This is governmental annual budget and community annual budget. As far as we are a community-based organization, we are concentrating our efforts on communities and trying to encourage them to include this line because it's absent, and to have special money within their annual budget for disaster preparedness and prevention for their communities. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm here wearing several hats, but would be talking on behalf of the Global Network for Civil Society Organizations for Disaster Reduction, quite a mouthful. But this network is a network of about 500 plus organizations all over the world. And one of the recent works has been on a community-based risk assessment which we carried out globally in 2009, and I'm going to present you some glimpses of that survey. What was interesting about this whole community-based risk assessment, and coming from this crowdsourcing session and all, I'm a little overwhelmed here, but what it did really was go really beyond the scope of risk assessment per se, not just looking at damage and loss potential, but the idea of generating or spinning off a whole range of dialogues on risk management. And that was really the beauty of this whole exercise, which was carried out in over 48 countries. What we had was The survey itself was called Views from the Frontline, which is available on the website of this network. What it really did was, for the first time, we had a disaster risk reduction based survey at the grassroots, with communities, with local leaders, with people who had no idea about this jargon which we are so familiar with, and we kind of get used to using them on and off. Also, it helped us for the first time develop some kind of crude indicators on on defining resilience and defining household level resilience, something which we've all been struggling with. And I know people who are in this room who have been sharing their thoughts and experiences on how difficult it is to sometimes define and measure risk reduction because of a very intangible kind of implication it has. This survey used the Hyogo framework of action, of which we are all familiar with, as the basis, and therefore it measured the amount of progress the Hyogo framework of action has actually made at the grassroots. We do have the GAR 11. We have a session tomorrow which presents really the national picture and the reports which the national governments present. But this was kind of a shadow effort to look at what is happening on the front lines. An interesting aspect of this whole survey was that it allowed cultural interpretations in terms of looking at language barriers and religion, castes, and other ethnicity-related issues, and it sort of transcended over these and allowed some kind of consensus building and aggregation. And perhaps the most rewarding fact was that it was actually administered by complete non-professionals, volunteer, ordinary citizens who are used to working in villages, who are perhaps not even beyond the grade 10 in their education, who actually administered the survey, and the results have been amazing. The effort itself has actually cascaded into a lot of initiatives at local and regional level. Just to give you the idea of how broad the survey was, how wide-ranging, there were 48 countries covered and 400 organizations involved, and these were basically civil society organizations involved in the survey. How did they do this survey? They actually conducted a whole lot of community meetings day after day, held the questionnaire in hand and used various techniques which we are familiar with, participatory appraisals and other mapping techniques which my friend Edmond also mentioned to you briefly about. Used dialoguing as ways of setting up meetings with local government officials and with other influential people at the grassroots, and then try to see how we can develop consensus in terms of giving scores to various indicators. So it was very exhausting but a very exhilarating kind of activities. I realized that this is not the session to talk about what were the results of the survey, but I just wanted to highlight 4 things which people at the front line were saying, and I'm sure we can all relate to that national formulated policies are not generating widespread systemic changes in local practices. That got reinforced through this survey. Resources are scarce when it comes down to local level action and considered as one of the main constraints to progress. But there are resources which remain untapped because they are in a way unrecognized by the usual systems of disaster risk reduction programming. The foundation for building resilience is people's awareness and understanding of the risks that they face, and I'll come to that a little later. And of course, the whole talk about climate change providing us with an opportunity. But just to highlight the finding number 3, the foundation for building resilience is people's awareness. In effect, this is what people said, and it reinforced the need, the importance of where community-based assessments lie, and in terms of how they actually lead to building awareness of people. So it kind of set us in motion and into looking at this as an ongoing cycle of how risk assessments done periodically can actually lead to greater risk reduction ultimately. From a surveyor's point of view, there were a few things which became pretty obvious. One was that, we've spoken about IT technologies and all, but there is still a huge gap between the haves and the have-nots in terms of knowledge on risks. And this is where, one of the problems still remains that needs to be bridged. We've had a whole range of technology options presented to us yesterday and today, but there are still challenges, and we talked about this during the lunch hour, about half the population not having even access to electricity. So where do they run these technology gadgets? It obviously created awareness and risk reduction, because in some languages, for example, risk, danger, vulnerability all mean the same thing, and therefore how do you make some distinctions, and how do you really look at things which can be done in advance to prevent losses in a disaster situation. Interestingly, for the first time, I think the whole debate on risk reduction actually led to looking at local development programming and how it is perpetuating risks or in a way reducing risks either which way, and especially in areas where people have experienced disasters, who have seen what the suffering is really all about. It also brought in a bit of accountability into the whole system by, people talking about their rights, about their need, and how local governments have to ensure that they need to protect the lives of the population which has elected them to power. In many societies, in fact in all societies, I would say there are a lot of innovative risk reduction practices, traditional knowledges, which have not been validated scientifically for some reason or other, and therefore they remain kind of untapped. And this survey for the first time started to bring them out. There's a lot that needs to be done in terms of documentation, but it at least set the ball rolling. And I think fairly obvious, it started creating a buzz. I think the risk reduction is still in its infancy in many societies. We've been speaking about them in conferences, but it hasn't really percolated to the grassroots. And therefore, this survey actually started having a cross-sectoral kind of dialogue in which, you started looking at safe schools and hospitals and the need that they should function in event of a disaster. For communities, it also helped them articulate what the risks they face are and how that can be, factored into the local participatory, programming for development. In the region where I come from in India, there were some challenges and lessons learned. I'll point out two which were important and relevant to this discussion here. One is that, of course, we need to understand and recognize that communities are active players in assessing risk. We've seen this in the presentations before about how we can do the cloud sourcing kind of method, and also we also recognize that there are good traditional practices that need to be recognized. There are barriers, of course. A lot of communities and societies still feel that disaster losses are inevitable, and that mindset needs to be turned around, and that requires a lot of education awareness programs. There is, of course, a visible discomfort with using quantitative indicators, things which we feel very happy about when we see progress and we find it easy to measure. But when it comes to talking to communities and engaging in this kind of community meetings, we find that as a problem area. So we need to get around this, find more innovative and creative means of actually being able to measure risk at community level. The other part was we found that there is still this barrier for upstream acceptance, which Daniel had been mentioning in his Ignite presentation yesterday as well, about how governments view community-based risk assessments. Either they find them as threats, or there is a kind of a kind of suspicion about what are the communities trying to drive them to. So I think it's all hovering around this issue about accountability and keeping your hands off as one way of trying to be in the safe zone and not be accountable to people. So just to conclude, what is the way forward and how do we look at all this process which has been initiated over the last couple of years? One is that, I think we need to reinforce and make this kind of a given in all work that we do, that community-based risk assessments do form the starting point, and therefore they should be as essential part of any work that we do at the grassroots. The second, I think we should, and this conference is saying this very loud and clear, that we need to use and leverage new technologies and methods wherever possible. I think we've made a communication leap in terms of mobile phones, even in developing countries, and then how that can be leveraged to do this kind of surveys, to do this kind of knowledge sharing. The other part, and that is where I started off this discussion, is that how do you make these assessments spiral out into more useful products and processes which can be used in larger programming sense. And one of this is how knowledge can be aggregated based on these assessments, realizing, of course, the nature of this kind of knowledge, which is crude, which is not validated at times, and can have a lot of noise in the system. Also, the moment you start having these assessments, you help communities to articulate, and therefore that becomes the basis for dialogue. And that's something which we need to develop further, because I think there's less work done in this area. And we should take gratitude from this fact that the most meaningful outcomes should lead to greater accountability towards communities at risk. This is one aspect which is at the center stage of all this discussion. We've seen accountability in many other areas, but somehow we're lagging behind on these rights of public safety, on these issues about how governments need to be responsible for ensuring that their citizens are safe. I'll end here, and I'll ask Maya to focus on her experience in Lebanon on the same survey. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Maya, and I also represent the Global Network for Disaster Reduction, but I also work for World Vision Lebanon on disaster risk management, community-based disaster risk management. So before I start with my presentation, I'd like to tell you why we chose, as Lebanon, to go for views from the front line. First, the very interesting thing was that we had no data whatsoever on disaster risks in Lebanon. Nothing. Not from the government, not from the UN, not from any other organization. So we had a real lack on that front. Second of all, we as World Vision in Lebanon wanted to start doing disaster risk management programs. And we didn't have any assessment or baseline information to start working from. So views from the front line was also a very good start for that. Third, no disaster risk reduction whatsoever had been done by the government, by the Lebanese government, because of other competing priorities and because most of you know that it's a quite politically volatile context and there are more important issues on the government's agenda than disaster risk reduction. Plus, I'd like to share with you that we have a very vibrant civil society in Lebanon. And civil society has usually a lot to say and to do. So we thought it was a great opportunity to activate the civil society into working on disaster risk reduction. And last but not least, I think this has been mentioned, but as World Vision and also as the global network, we think that community-based disaster risk management and community ownership is very important. So we thought that this community-based survey would really bring communities into the whole disaster risk management process. So basically, we'll have a very short overview about disasters in Lebanon, community engagement and views from the front line and perspectives on risk, recommendations by the communities themselves, and current initiatives that resulted from views from the front line. This is the map of Lebanon, as you can see. Sorry. So basically, before we started with views from the front line, we tried to dig for secondary data that would at least give us an overview on the at-risk communities in Lebanon, and communities at risk of disasters. Basically, what we came up with was, from a study from the UNDP, the main disasters that happened over the past 30 years, and that also included man-made disasters like conflict. So you can see here we have internal conflict, floods, storms, cross-border war, and wildfires. But that's not all, because, I mean, this is only a 30-year span. In Lebanon, we previously had many earthquakes, and it's still an earthquake-prone area, even though it's not mentioned here. We're having droughts as a result of climate change as well, so we're also not forgetting that, even though it's not mentioned here. So basically, the secondary data we gathered from the UNDP just allowed us to choose the risk-prone communities so we could actually talk to them and administer the surveys with them. So basically, for the survey process, we interviewed 3 groups of people. Community leaders, or I would say local government leaders, working on different sectors. We also interviewed community representatives, and we interviewed representatives of civil society organizations. Now, the very interesting thing is, I'm talking out of experience with the frontline or with the communities, is when we first started administering the surveys through some of our partner local organizations, we were faced with some questions like, sorry, we don't have disasters in that area, or why are you doing this study? It seems you know that something's coming. So we were faced by communities who had no idea why we were doing this, and who really had no perception whatsoever of the risks that would happen in their area, except for, as you can imagine, conflict. So most of their mindset was focused on conflict and wars, because it was the disaster that was recurring in the country. But they were completely disregarding the fact that they could be prone to floods, to earthquakes, to local wildfires, and so on. So when we actually administered the surveys, we realized that communities started thinking a bit more about, oh yeah, our community is prone to fires. Yes, my grandpa told me that we had a really bad earthquake. And then they started thinking in terms of how the climate is affecting their communities and which localized disasters they could actually face. and not just conflict itself. So when we gathered the information in every community, we went back to the community with the same information, and we consulted with them. We presented the results, and we were expecting them to give us our feedback and recommendations. This is what they came up with. Those recommendations are a summary of all the areas that we talked to them. The community recommended conducting risk assessments in consultation with specialists, and when I say specialists, I mean scientists, because they realized that there was a gap between risk information at the higher level and their knowledge of risks. So they wanted to meet with scientists to be able to identify major risks and dangers for every specific area in Lebanon. They also suggested developing community-based early warning systems with a risk communication plan. And they suggested to conduct awareness sessions on disaster risk identification and prevention. And that was really an achievement because the communities before had not been exposed to any of this information. And then they realized how important that was for them. So basically, what came up of all this study and what are we currently encouraging? So basically, in each of these areas, we now have community-based disaster risk management committees that have representatives in the national DRR platform. I'd like to say that World Vision, with some other stakeholders, facilitated the formation of a national platform for disaster reduction, which also includes now some ministries. And the great thing about this national platform is that for the first time it includes actual people from the communities. So it's not only high-level people or legislators or decision makers, it's these people, but also people from the front line or from the communities. And second, that's an initiative which has already started. There is a common risk assessment mapping which is taking place for the communities in Lebanon, which is being undertaken by World Vision in partnership with other organizations. And this risk mapping aims at having a common sort of disaster risk management plan for the communities in Lebanon. That's about it. Thank you.
So thank you very much to our panelists for the presentations. I'll now ask them to come up on the stage, where we'll take some questions, and also we have one written question, or actually it's one written question with 3 parts. And after this, we'll just sort of open the floor for questions and discussions and comments. I think it's quite interesting. Between the 5 of us, a lot of us didn't know each other before the session, before we started planning this, and we realized very quickly that although we're coming from all different parts of the world, the challenges we're facing and the processes we're following are very much the same. And I think it's very motivating to see that it seems like we're all heading in the right direction. We're all heading in the same direction. We assume it's the right direction. Anyway, the written question isn't to anyone in particular, so I'll ask for one of you to volunteer to answer this. It's 3 parts. So depending on how the first question is answered, then we can move on to the second parts. But in summary, it's if you ever compare these community-based risk assessments with risk assessments done by experts or specialists, if you actually make this comparison, if you do, What are the results? Are they different? Are they the same? Are there some interesting disparities between them? And how do the communities themselves sort of deal with these differences, and do they understand why there are differences, and what kind of implications does that have? So I don't know if anyone wants to volunteer to answer that.
I can share one experience of comparing our results with the specialist results. Especially it was done for GTZ when one professional organization, NGO called GeoRisk, they were asked to implement hazard mapping in 2 regions of Armenia, and in the same time we did the vulnerability and capacity assessment in the same regions and in the same communities. The outcome was that after having these 2 results, the decision was like as the mathematical formulation shows risk, this is multiplication of hazard and vulnerability, to multiply the results of hazard assessment and vulnerability assessment. And as a result, the 2 organizations, we sit together and discussed how will we measure the hazard level and the vulnerability level to be close with the figures and the approach, and we selected the Richter scale for evaluating the vulnerability level. And as a result, what was the interesting that when they explain how they assess the community in terms of hazard and how they estimate the level of the hazard, of being hazard prone, and how we did it for vulnerability, the results were very close. And in many cases we could prove them that they haven't considered this or that fact and didn't pay attention proper to this or that fact, and the same was in our case, but we reached a consensus and we used that like approximately same method for evaluation and get the final result of risk, like the risk index for each community, and in this way we define the most risky communities in these 2 regions. And this was our experience of being engaged with professional NGO in the risk assessment. Thank you.
Thank you, Edmund. I have no other written questions, so if anyone out there has a question or comment, you're very welcome to come to the microphone here. I see one, 2, and then we'll move on after that. Please.
I had a question for the gentleman from Armenia. Was your work, did it focus on earthquakes primarily, or what other hazards and risks are you concerned with?
And this is mostly flood, mud flow, the most current, common disasters for our communities, and which are most usually happen in the communities and trigger their life.
So not earthquakes?
No, not earthquake. In terms of earthquake, right now we are implementing project by the funding of DPECO, and this is called to raise people's awareness and preparedness, and through using non-structural mitigation approach to raise their preparedness to withstand earthquake. But this is not the assessment of the risk.
Yes, I would like to know is any of the project, any of the experience have any experience bringing technical expertise to the community from the national agencies, including the universities or professionals who could bring, they could lower the technical terminology at the level, no lower, just appropriate at the appropriate level of the community?
Manu, you can answer that. I think it's on.
Hello? Yeah. Well, yes, we, I mean, not as part of the risk assessment per se, but yes, there were several such efforts on how do we bridge this gap between the, the technical manpower and the technical knowledge and the communities who are facing the risk. I know Brian is somewhere in this room, and he was part of this process of doing shake table tests at community level, and these are usually high-end shake table tests done in, in in pre-state conditions in labs and all. But we had to take this to the community to bring out this point about the importance of retrofitting, for example. And we did it using, very simple tools, and we built prototypes, and that's where I think the technical expertise really, struggled with simplifying all the terminologies they are used to using, and actually through a very live demonstration could convey a point about the need for safe buildings against earthquakes. So there have been very good examples, and sometimes one feels, being in a civil society organization throughout my education, after my education, I feel frustrated that there's not enough efforts being made of bringing technical expertise to the front lines. I think there is still a lot of mutual suspicion and some kind of, being in our silos that prevents this, and that's why I think disasters continue to happen.
I'd like to add something from personal experience as well. Last year we had our first national workshop, which included representatives from the government, community people, representatives from the community, as well as civil society organizations. So basically, it was not premeditated, or we had not planned to do this, but our role ended up becoming the role of a facilitator between the technical experts and the community representatives. So we found ourselves kind of translating the language of scientists to the communities and vice versa. So I think civil society organizations also play a very big role in that.
Thank you, Maya and Manu. If I could ask the people coming to the microphone to introduce themselves. I know, Pablo, everybody knows you, but just in case there's a few unfortunate souls who don't know you.
Okay. Well, what will I say after that? My name is Pablo Suarez. I work with the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center, and I'm also a researcher on a climate risk modeler. Building on what you said, Daniel, in the beginning, of the contrast between almost everything else happening in this event, which is very much technology-centered, versus here, which is very much people-centered. And we continue to see this gap that we're trying to bridge, and we celebrate everybody's presence here under the same roof. Two questions. One, especially for Nicole, because I'm involved in the upcoming Climate Outlook Forum for the Caribbean, and I hope you or someone from the team can join. But in one of the sessions earlier, there was climate modelers saying, we want to hear from users, what should we be forecasting in a day, in a week, in a season, or in a decade? What are the relevant questions? But we find that it's very difficult for practitioners to have a conversation with a scientist, because there's different languages, there's different attitudes. So what would you like to ask the scientists to do if they want to invite you to converse with them? What can scientists do to better invite humanitarian sector to the conversation? That's question one. And the other one, possibly more for you, Daniel, but anyone is welcome.
That's not allowed.
Okay, then whoever. Another one of the sessions today was about this crowdsourcing. How can we use newly available technologies, like punch some numbers in your cell phone and a blob pops up in a web page showing in what location someone is about to die or some help may be available. What are the institutional challenges that you encounter in trying to integrate new technologies into our decision-making, including decision-making for risk assessment, but also for actual action? How can we embrace technology if we are so people-centered, but technology can help?
The forecasting question is fairly straightforward. Communities, they want to know how what you are forecasting will affect them. But the problem with scientists is they stop at the forecasting. And you do a great forecast, but how's that helping me down the road? Where's the solution to the forecast? You go, oh, we're going to have a drought. Good news. Yeah, and how's that helping me? What's the mitigation strategy to help me with this drought, to protect my livelihood? And we need to get to the other part of that question. Because right now all we're talking about is the research and not about the solution. And that's where we need to be.
Does anybody else want to contribute to that?
And also, to answer to the question, in many cases, many of us mentioned here that education, awareness raising, all this directed to the next generation to solve the problem, to make the disaster risk reduction as like component of our usual life. But we should consider that communities are not prepared to think about this now, because they are mostly concentrated on their social and economical problems, and it's very difficult to convince them to think about something which can happen after 10 or 20 years.
Please go ahead.
I just wanted to answer Pablo's first question. I think one of the ways forward in terms of getting the scientists to invite humanitarians like us on a common sort of talking table is, through these alliances, which are now becoming much more of a comfortable medium. Because, this kind of enabling dialogue does not happen overnight. It does not happen in one meeting. It takes its time to understand and to be able to respect each other's point of view. And therefore, having sustained relationships, having areas where you anchor your collaboration needs to be put in place when we are doing the this kind of alliance and bridge building. But that's one way. I mean, I don't have the full answer for this perhaps, but this is one way where we find a good potential of going in.
Before I give an answer to the second question, does anybody else want to answer that one or not? Otherwise, okay.
Let me take the mic again. I think embracing this technology won't really change the equations per se. I mean, the equations about the governments looking at local community-based assessments with suspicion and all that. What technology would really do, and that is where we struggled in as part of the view from the front line, is increasing the coverage areas. Knowing very well that we are working with very crude indicators for resilience, this kind of technologies actually help us widen the search. In India, with almost 1 billion plus population, we could cover only a very, very small 0.0001 kind of percentage of people. And that, I guess, when we scale it up to globally, it's hardly a percentage to be taken into account. But that's where I think technology can do its bit. But and if that cascades into more credible sort of results in terms of saying to the decision makers, look here, we have now 1 million people saying this to you, then perhaps that would help in doing. In terms of anchoring, I think it has to be somewhere in a neutral ground. And again, I think Maya's point about civil societies organizations acting as anchors or facilitators would be something which needs to be worked upon. And that's where the potential is, in my opinion.
And I'll just give a brief answer from the IFRC perspective on Pablo's second question. I think the main challenge we have institutionally in really embracing these new technologies is mostly a lack of understanding and recognition of how they work, what they are, and the power that they can have. Using the example of IFRC, we use sort of social networking to get our message out, but the idea of getting the message back in through the same technology somehow isn't really filtered very far yet. But I think we're starting to get some real-world examples from our own experiences in Haiti, for example. During our response operations, we had an agreement with Voila, which is, I think, one of the main cell phone providers, mobile phone providers, and it was quite useful in helping us to target our response and relief work. So I think there's a growing recognition that we need to do more in this area. But we are a large network of national societies and a big bureaucracy in a sense, so things tend to move a bit slowly, but hopefully there'll be progress. Anyway, next question, please.
Hi, thanks for the presentations. My name is Zoe Trahanis, and I work here at the World Bank in the East Asia and Pacific region. And many of you touched in your presentations a bit, but I was hoping to get some more information on engagement with local government, because it's come up, but I think this is a big gap in many cases, because obviously communities can do a lot themselves and can take initiative, but in terms of sustainability, and of course with your help, but sustainability and policy decisions and development planning, budgeting is the job of the government. So maybe you could talk a bit more about, how you've tried, and it definitely from the Lebanon case that came across that was being done, but maybe to hear a bit more about what you're doing and what are some lessons maybe that we can take away. Because I know I've been working in Indonesia. There's an urban poverty program, and we've been trying to integrate DRR into community approaches. But that was through an existing CDD program, and it's a bit more challenging to go in at the community level where there aren't these types of programs and focus on DRR. Thanks.
And the interesting thing about the Lebanon case, when we did the Views from the Frontline project, is that there was a lot of engagement by the local government representatives. They acknowledged that they didn't have the resources. They also acknowledged that they didn't have any disaster risk management planning in any of their development policies. But they said that they were willing to be actively engaged in any of the initiatives proposed by civil society organizations. And what actually happened is that now with the disaster risk management committees that we have facilitated in the different areas, we do have local government representatives. The big challenge here, though, is they always refer to the central government for budgeting, for major decision making. So what's happening now is that they're still pretty much dependent on civil society for initiatives rather than the central government, because central government unfortunately hasn't prioritized DRR yet. So yeah. That's what we're facing for the moment.
Nicole?
I want to endorse everything Maya has just said. The programs generally try to engage the local government participants in the debate, but they actually come to you with a sense of, we're so glad you're doing this because we can't do it ourselves. And so what we try to do is, if the micro projects come up, then we get the local government engineers to endorse it, and even provide a technical support for it. And they're glad because they knew the work had to be done. They just didn't have the budget to do it. And you all in the World Bank would know better than us that when you look at the GDP to debt in many of the countries that we work in, they're really challenged for resources. So it would be nice to get some of those resources down at the community level.
Just to add from my experience working with local authorities, sometimes they look like kids and they are waiting for some sweets. And sweets for them, this is these micro projects. And whenever you are entering communities, like just for preparedness measures, for assessment, and like many of them can say that, but why do we need it now? Now let's spend this money for mitigation to build a dike, to clean a river bank and whatever. And when you are trying to convince and explain them that this is one of the activities of the risk reduction, but we are not here to provide you with money or technical support. We are here to raise your capacities in terms of your preparedness and awareness of the general population, to help you to establish disaster risk management mechanisms in place. And the micro projects, this is one of our, our advantage which we are providing you to encourage you and to attract your attention to this project. But this is not common for all, but we face really such a problems. And as for World Bank, it's my personal experience that it's important to secure some funding within community-level disaster risk reduction projects for mitigation activities. It should be co-funded by the communities or by other stakeholders, I'm sure, but there should be some funds for this activity.
Thank you. We can have the next question, please.
I am Paolo Gasparini from the University of Napoli. I worked for many years and working since many years on the problems of early warnings, especially of earthquakes, but also of other natural disasters. And so I want to address one question concerning the early warning and in general the forecasting problem. In my experience, I found that the greatest obstacle to the application of early warning methodologies is the problem of false alarms. Any early warning or early forecasting has a probability of false alarm that's not very low. And there are many countries where early warning is not considered in any law, in any legislation. This leads to a very difficult situation because decision makers and administrators are quite reluctant to make warnings or to accept forecasting from scientists because of this problem of liability and responsibilities. So I think this is the main obstacle in the application of early warning. Of course, a community-based early warning can help administrators to take decisions on that because, for instance, people well informed will know that there is a probability of false alarm, and so there will be no distrust for future early warning. But anyway, I think one major problem is the legal problem. I want to know, in your experience, how this is dealt with, and if it's solved in some of your countries.
Anybody want to volunteer?
I would like to share our experience in terms of early warning. I'm not sure with earthquakes, but we work when we work in terms of floods and mostly floods. What we propose to communities, we are proposing them the in-community early warning mechanisms, because early warning contains from several steps, and the last ones, this is how and this warning and through which pipes will get the community and how this information will spread within the community, and will be this just information about some occasion, or this will be continued with instructions what to do and how to do. And like in our context in Armenia, at the beginning it was very interesting because all the officials, like, they were against of this idea, saying that we have early warning and we inform from region to communities about this or that threat. But when we raise the question, what's then? Community leader, this is one person and this is not entire community. What's then? How community reacts to this information? And there is nothing. And what we propose them to use the different mechanisms, starting from church bells, starting from focal points for certain areas, like the one of the proposals was also related to forecasting, to have a focal point within the community, because, like we mentioned, that there are communities who even haven't electricity, and like internet connection, the computer, this is not common for all communities, and to use even each community has 1 or 2 or 3 computers, to use existence of this capacity at place, and to give a forecast, to spread a forecast within the community. This is from our experience, and we developed some chart showing the in-community early warning mechanisms, and we provide it to communities, and make them committed to continue this, to follow this.
Thank you, Edmund. Manu, you have something to add?
Well, I don't think I have the answer for this because this is a serious problem, and I completely agree with you, sir, that we are grappling with this on a daily basis. I've worked with communities who are living in squatter colonies within the riverbanks, and every time there is heavy rains, we have an opposite situation to what you described, sir, where actually the governments go on an overdrive because they don't want to be seen to have not heeded the warning. They force evacuate, even call the army if they require and 9 times out of 10 there are no floods, So the community is kind of, looks at government initiated warnings with a lot of suspicion, and obviously they don't want to move out. But what worked in that particular community was, as Edmond described, visible signs of lurking danger. And in this particular case, community had its own ways of assessing the high flood level. And when there was a warning upstream, there was a network of whatever telephone calls or where they warned their downstream communities that the flood levels are rising, and that's what convinced communities better. So I guess I'm just reinforcing the answers which my colleagues gave. It's about having a combination, how governments could also look at the communities' ways of understanding and believing in real risks, and then working on that.
Thank you, Manu. I think in the interest of time, I'd like to limit to the last 2 questions, the 2 people standing there, because I also have 2 more written questions I've received. So please.
Olga Wilhelmi, MCAR. Thanks very much for your presentations. It was really interesting to hear about it. My question is about sort of resources. For example, if somebody is interested in conducting community-based assessment, where they would go? Are there any sort of information in terms of best practices for conducting community-based risk assessment or success stories in implementation of those assessments for building resilient communities? Are there any resources that would be available either through Red Cross or World Bank that would be helpful for communities who would like to engage in the process?
I can answer that partially, but if you can go ahead, Maya.
Yeah. I think I can speak on behalf of the Global Network for Disaster Reduction, and Manu, if you have anything to add. Part of the success of the Global Network for Disaster Reduction is being able to voice out the opinion of the different civil society organizations in over 40 countries on risk perceptions of communities and on results of community-based risk assessments, and on the discussion of best practices as well, which are posted on the Global Network for Disaster Reduction website. And the website itself also encourages blog discussions and is open for anyone. And whoever wants to access the website can actually get in there and be part of the blogs and discussions, and can even access some of the resources that were posted there on some community-based risk assessments. I hope I answered your question.
And if I could, I'll just add to that briefly. From the Red Cross tool, the VCA Vulnerability and Capacity Assessment, there's a lot of guidance material, and it's on our website. If you can't find it, just email me. And also, if you go to the website of the Prevention Consortium, which is now defunct, but there's still a lot of good information on the website, there's a community risk assessment toolkit, which brings together all sorts of different approaches and different guidance materials from the Red Cross, from NGOs, from all sorts of civil society organizations. So there's a lot out there, just a matter of finding it. Next question, please.
Hello, my name is Mike Buckley, and just finished a 30-year career with FEMA, now in a consulting capacity. But I worked in hazard identification and hazard mitigation for that time. And one of the things that we noticed in this country is when there's a disaster, that many of the businesses, especially some of the small businesses, a large percentage of them never really reopen. So the business community has a big stake in this whole issue of hazard mitigation, understanding their risk and so forth. Would like for you to comment on how you engaged with the business communities in your efforts. Thank you.
Yeah, I have two examples to share with you. Of course, more information is available on the respective websites, but in New Delhi, where I stayed, we worked with scrap dealers who recycle waste, and they have major stakes in in this kind of scenarios, and therefore they actually came about together to actually erect fire posts in their own community without even waiting for the local fire stations to act. So yes, I agree with you completely. They have big stakes, and perhaps they are the best kind of leaders for local level risk reduction initiatives in urban areas particularly. A similar example is in Philippines. In many of the smaller cities, the shopkeepers came together to find solutions for local flooding problems, because that closed down their businesses for sufficient periods of time every year, and that obviously affected their incomes. So there are a lot of such good examples at local level, but it hasn't really sort of bubbled up to major sort of aggregation of such businesses who are looking at risks to natural disasters yet.
Okay, if there's no other comments, actually I have a quick example too from Sudan actually. Some years ago the Sudanese Red Crescent worked together with Coca-Cola Sudan on doing a risk assessment, because Coca-Cola recognized while their facilities weren't at risk, when it floods, their employees couldn't come to work and the company lost money. So obviously there's a clear economic incentive there, and they worked with Sudanese Red Crescent to understand where the risk is and to help find ways of protecting their own employees. So there are some initiatives happening out there, but I think as Manu said, it needs to bubble up a bit more at the grassroots level. So, to our last two questions. First, we have a question for Nicole, which is, how do you actually explain tsunami wave attenuation to people who have not experienced a tsunami? Microphone, can you use?
I don't. Basically, I think SEDIMA just recently brought out, along with the Seismic Research Unit, a very simple guidance for communities, which says if you feel it, run. Yeah? We're not even trying to explain it. We're just trying to tell people what to do to be safe when it happens. So there's some simple posters and radio ads and things like that that they're sharing with the community that says basically if you feel the earthquake, don't wait to be told, run. Yeah? And they show you what direction to run to, which is very interesting. So you run in the right direction.
Okay. And Maya, you're the lucky winner of the last question. Question is, can community engagement in risk assessment heal political, religious, and social divides?
Wow. Tough question. Actually, I can look at this from one perspective. As you might know, we have a very diverse society. We have a lot of political affiliations and religious denominations in a very small country. So we always face divide among communities wherever we work. The very interesting thing about risk assessments is the communities we engaged themselves were quite heterogeneous. So they were all from different political and religious backgrounds. And that risk assessment and the fact that they were part of providing recommendations for future disaster risk reduction initiatives was a connector for people from different social, religious, and political backgrounds. So I don't know if I answered your question, but yes, they found a common denominator, which is basically reducing risks in their communities, regardless of their political, social, and religious divide. So, yeah.
Thank you, Mai. I think that's a very inspiring note to end on. I want to thank all of you for coming to this decidedly non-technical session. I'm happy to see the interest is there, so that's great. And just to give a final round of applause to our excellent panelists.